Hello, sword people. Welcome to the Sword Guy podcast. This is your host, Dr. Guy Windsor, consulting swordsman, teacher, and writer. Join me for interviews with historical martial arts instructors and experts from a wide range of related disciplines as we discuss swords, history, training, and bringing the joy of historical martial arts into our modern lives. I hope you enjoy this greatest hit episode of the show. You can find all the episodes at swordschool.com/podcast, and there's a direct link in the description to this episode's show notes. On with the show. I'm here today with Mike Loades, who is a fight arranger, weapons historian, director, and author. And if you've been swinging swords, certainly in Britain at least, at any point in the last 30 years, you'll certainly have heard of him. So I'm very pleased to say, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Mike, whereabouts in the world are you?
Today I'm in Portugal. So I have recently moved to Portugal.
Oh, wow.
So I come from the UK, but I've spent the last 12 years in California. Okay. My wife's an American. And in the middle of a pandemic, we moved to Portugal.
Any particular reason?
There is a list, but it was partly because my wife thought that she'd married a European, and when were we ever going to live in Europe? What we want, we better hurry up because there's this little thing called Brexit. And during the transition year, we have an opportunity that I can get residency with ease.
Right.
So,
okay.
I had just finished writing a book, and I was just about to start another project, and there was a window when it said, "Shall we do it? Well, let's go and have a look." And we just did it.
Lovely.
Pandemic. Very odd.
Well, yes, I imagine that makes things a little bit harder.
Yeah. Well, especially when going back to the States, and we sold our house and cars. Wow. I sold my horse, and
that must have been quite hard.
Immensely.
Selling a horse.
Immensely.
So, do you have horses in Portugal?
Well, I don't have my own yet, but okay. I am now riding it. One of the lures of Portugal for me is, I've had a long-term interest in Iberian horsemanship.
Sure.
And I'm still learning. And I know I've come to the best place in the world to learn, to learn more about one of my passions, which is Iberian horsemanship. So
that's probably the best reason to move to a country. Yeah. Fantastic. So,
and also after, I'm rooted in Britain, and deep roots with family and culture and everything. And I miss it. And I'm 2 hours away.
Sure. After
12 years in Northern California, I wasn't sure I was ready for British weather again.
It's not easy.
So again, there were many boxes that it ticked.
Yeah, I moved to the UK from Finland, and I must say the lighter weather here, there's more light and there's much less snow, and I occasionally miss the snow, but really this is a bit like moving from Britain to California, moving from Finland to Britain.
Okay.
Marvellous. Okay, now you've been swinging swords longer than most of us, and I remember back in the 90s when I was just getting started with the historical swordsmanship thing, which we didn't even know what to call it yet. We'd all heard of you doing things like small sword and long sword and fight direction and what have you. So were you aware that there was this growing
yes.
practice of historical swordsmanship? Okay. What did it look like from your perspective?
It looked like suddenly I was going to have friends in the world.
Oh wow, that's lovely.
It looked like it's. I had trained with John Waller, who you will also know.
Yes, of course.
Who was my dear friend, and I joined up with him in 1972.
Wow. Okay.
That's
just for context. I was born in 73.
There you go. I'm 70 now. So,
right.
So it was a while ago. I had a place at law school. I was going to go to law school, and then the history of the Longbow by Robert Hardy aired on the BBC.
Yes,
and it was my epiphany And it was, oh my goodness, because it was that was the first documentary that had featured what we now call reenactment. And it was John Waller and a number of other people doing stuff. And it was like, my goodness, this is, I'd always had this passion for history. I'd always shot bows. I used to fence at school. I'd always ridden horses. Suddenly these things were starting to coalesce into a signature thing that also chimed with my interest in telling stories and wanting to be a documentary filmmaker. And everything came at once. And at that moment, John had started a medieval centre down in Sussex. And I bought a caravan and said no thanks to law school, and I went down and lived in my caravan behind a pub and worked in the pub and spent every day with John learning to sword fight, shoot bows and arrows, fly hawks, develop a medieval style of riding, and that was that. And then, one thing led to another, and that venture didn't actually materialize as it was intended, but the seeds were sown and a new life was hatched, which was the pursuance of detective work, of uncovering the physical experience of the past, and at every turn, the light bulb started to go off. Oh, what you see in the Hollywood films is not real. Oh, that's more to do with medieval studies. The Middle Ages weren't as they are portrayed. This is exciting. This is somewhere to go and explore. This is an adventure you can have with books at home and a chair. There's travel to do here, and things to find out. And so there's that discovery. But then also, at that stage, I'm young. So the physicality of it, pushing the boundaries, being a little bit, edgier, riskier with the things one did, whether it's with horses or with swords, all of that was an adrenaline fuel to the passion. But the passion was discovery. And I suppose that the third leg of the tripod is the beauty, the aesthetics of it all. Right. And I found with John someone who was driven by that, with shape and form, and how form and function dovetailed. And when they dovetailed, then you had beauty. A perfectly executed lunge. And then right. At that time, 1971, I think, Wise's book,
Arthur Wise, yeah.
His book comes out, and for the first time in my life, I see the images of Capoferro and Gigandi and all these. I loved it. It was astonishing, because I loved movement. I've always been a movement person. If I'd had longer legs, maybe I'd have been a ballet dancer. I don't. Okay. That book and even Schools and Masters of Fence had only recently been published. 1970, 71, 72, these things for the first time. Those two
Schools and Masters of Fence was reissued.
My generation, as the internet is to the current generation, and Wiktenauer and all that wonderful, access. Only Michael Chichester had been older than me.
Yeah, I felt that many times.
It would have been a different story. But I had John Waller, and I had Wise, and I had Edgerton Castle, and I was fired by it. And we sought from the outset, then, back in the early 70s, the goal was to rediscover the European martial arts. That was the goal. That's what we were looking for. But we didn't have the community. We didn't have as many people. We didn't have as many brains at work. And we certainly didn't have the resources. And it's the old story, that the dwarf sees further than the giant, provided that he's standing on the giant's shoulders.
Yeah.
And that has always been the way with and that quote comes at the beginning of Ewart Oakeshott's Archaeology of Weapons, and Ewart was another primary influence on my life at that time. He was a friend of John's, and I met him, and Ewart was very much a mentor who cultivated my love of swords, and legitimized that there was an academic interest in swords, and that there was academic study to be had here and value. And so it's this juxtaposition between being young and wanting adventure and wanting to jump about and take risks and swing swords, but also to cultivate this inquiry and investigation as to what then was still not yet discovered, but now is much more, thanks to Eva. But also, the art of it, the art history of it, and the academia side of it, all of this meshed with me and was developing and forming throughout the 1970s. But, I was in my 20s, and like most people in their 20s, it wasn't fully formed. But all of those seeds were there. And then in the 80s, I started teaching at drama schools.
Ah, okay.
Because I had these twin interests. I had an academic, intellectual, if you like, interest in history and swords and this investigation of sword fighting and other martial skills, including archery and horsemanship. But a general martial interest and drive. But I also had a passion for photography. At one stage, that's what I was going to do before I thought I'd go to law school. Ended up doing neither. But I was, I was going to go to art school and do photography. Photography was a big drive for me, and filmmaking was an aspiration. So the drama school thing, John had got some work in drama schools, and then a college became free, and I started to step up in there, and that became my laboratory.
Right.
So I detest the term stage fight.
Okay.
And I detested it at the time, and I campaigned in all the schools that I taught. Do not put stage fight on the timetable. You don't put stage voice, stage acting, stage dancing. You put historical dance. You put voice class. You put acting class. You are immediately undercutting everything you believe about acting, which is to find a truth, by giving it the prefix stage. And what I want to inculcate with my students is this was a genuine historical art. Yes, we will develop techniques that stop you bleeding, or prevent you.
That's fair. Yeah.
And obviously there is an element of keeping the little darling safe, but they nonetheless. What we strive towards was hitting shapes, hitting forms that evoked the images I had seen in what manuscripts I'd seen at that time. And then by the 80s, I'm starting to explore original manuscripts. And at that stage, to look at a manuscript.
They were hard to find.
Yeah. I mean, so, in the 80s, you would have to write to the Tower of London, where the Royal Armouries were at that stage, and gain appointment to the library. And you would have to wear gloves, quite rightly, and only carry a pencil.
Yes, of course.
In order to make notes. And yes, then you could get out, their edition of Talhofer and have a look at it and make notes. God, what the fuck's going on here? Oh, there you go, your first edit point.
No. You can say whatever the fuck you like on my show.
Okay. And that was such a thrill. You felt like a pioneer going in there.
Right.
Guys, has anyone really asked these questions for? Now, we didn't get the answers.
You asked the questions.
This came later, but I was asking the questions then. And jumping ahead, this stream of consciousness unfolding has come from your simple question. Did I notice Hemo in the 90s?
Right.
And it in the 90s, I lived in Scotland. And I still was teaching 5 days a week at drama schools in London. But, Ryanair made it possible because it was like £1 a flight to go from Glasgow down to London. So I travelled down on a Sunday night and travelled back on a Friday night. And obviously you had massive holidays with the drama school. So it was doable. And my wife was Scottish and we lived in Scotland, just south of Glasgow. But there I had access to the library at Kelvin Grove.
Oh, wow. That's
Bob Wisdom Savage was the curator at the time, and I was constantly going there with a pair of gloves and a pencil. and it was in a little tiny cupboard. And all these books. It was just so thrilling and so exciting, but kind of lonely. I had John with it.
How many people understand what you mean when you say, I was handling a towel off a manuscript the other day?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did I notice in the 90s? Yes, of course I noticed. Because I'd been doing it poorly, ineptly, unsupported by a larger community, unsupported by a hive mind, which is when the synapses join up and, I'm fluent in medieval German. So this is what this is. I didn't know we didn't have those resources. But within the resources we had, the fire was there, the spark was there, the inquiry was there. And so I thought, this is great. This is great. People are starting to notice because obviously one always felt, I'm not sure this has changed, but one always felt like an oddball.
Yeah. Sometimes we still do. Depends who we're with.
And it was great. It was exciting, and there was a regret in thinking, if only I was 20 now, what could I have made of it?
Right.
You can't have regrets, and it's what it was. And I had the thrill of being at the key edge. You also get the embarrassment of, especially if you write anything down. You're very brave to write it in your 30s.
Yes, this is true.
Because the dreadful thing about writing stuff down is it's there, and people in 15 years' time can come back to you and say, "Oh, did you know?" Oh, I do.
How incredibly wrong you were. Yeah.
Nobody else knew then either.
Yeah.
But
you can always write another book. I mean, I wrote my Swordsman's Companion came out in 2004, and by 2010 it was obsolete, and I wrote a different book that kind of replaces it. And I just put a thing in the introduction to the second edition of the Swordsman's Companion saying everything in here is entirely obsolete, right? So if you bought this looking for a training manual of like current material, you've bought the wrong book. But if you go to my website here, you can download a free copy of its replacement volume, so you can get all the technical stuff that you want from there. So we can.
Well, of course, absolutely. Of course you can. Of course you can.
And if we don't write it down, people aren't going to react to it, and that's how we find out that we were wrong and we can fix it. So
I had something else that came out in 1992. I probably made it in 1991, so very much in the 90s, which was at that time a VHS video called "The Blow by Blow Guide to Sword Fighting in the Renaissance Style."
I've forgotten that. I've seen that. I saw that in the 90s. I'd forgotten that was you. I remember the video. That was great.
And it's no longer available because I didn't turn it to DVD. I didn't keep it going because it dated. Because my thinking shifted. There's very conversation we're having. I didn't then make a new one saying, this is the one.
Okay. On behalf of literally everybody listening.
It's time. Really pioneering.
On behalf of everybody listening, I have a request. Okay. Can you, if you still have the files, put a short disclaimer at the front saying, this is totally outdated. I no longer think these things, but this is part of historical martial arts history. And so put that thing out where people can get it, because it's part of our cultural history as historical sword people.
Well, it is.
And it would be awesome if we could have it. So if you would please do that, I would be very pleased.
The Composite, it was groundbreaking in its time, and it
was,
and it lured a lot of people into thinking and doing things. And no, I can't. I actually destroyed the Masters last year.
Oh no!
Yeah, because we were moving from California to Portugal, and I was turning 70 and going, I don't need to carry all this stuff with me anymore.
Okay. All right. If I can find someone who has the VHS still,
yeah, I might have.
I will see if I can get it digitized for you, and then I can send you those files if you want. Not as good as the Martyrs, but
I appreciate the sentiment behind it. We'll think about it, but I in the internet age, I think I might be more protective of my reputation going forward. That people will think I did a film about archery as well, called Archery: Its History and Forms.
Yeah,
which I also did in the 90s. And it was extremely Anglo-centric, although it did feature, again, at that time, nobody knew about these things. It featured dear old Ted McEwen, another of my mentors, who was a thumb ring archer and a maker of composite bows. And it was the first time anyone had seen somebody making a composite bow on film. So it had so many good things in it. I did take that to DVD, and I have subsequently made that freely available on my YouTube channel, which doesn't have many things on it, but it has that on it.
I'll find a link and put it in the show notes.
Constantly get remarks going, you've got no Native American Indian archery in here.
Oh, for God's sake.
Well, no, I haven't. And there's no, you haven't got the Mongols in here. No, but I mentioned the Turks. I mean, and it was very Anglo-centric. It was, because I brought it out in England, purely for sale in England or Britain, in 1994 or whatever. And it's just an historical piece. And I say, and the thing, I do not agree with many of the statements that I made in this film 40 years ago. So some of the penetration stuff, and
sure,
we can come on to. I don't stand by everything said in this film.
Well, of course not.
But to generations of people, it was an important film about archery. So I'm kind of having a little bit of a bad experience with that. So I'll think about the sword fighting thing. I would just add one thing, and you might want to pre-insert it, but it did. Sure. In the days when in the 70s, when we were first exploring these things, and in my 20s, early 20s, some of the things I read about, in wives or castles, that they used wasters. And well, what is a waster? Nobody talked about a waster or anything like that. But we sort of, went to the hardware store and got a dowel and put a bit of sort of plumber's insulation pipe over it, and sort of, and then really
went for
it. Went for free play, because that was a much more comfortable option to what we'd been doing previously, which was stripping to the waist and using fencing sabers. Usually after a certain amount of
pints.
And I
have photographs of that. I did that with my friends in the Tour Duel Society in the 90s. I have actually photographs of me stripped to the waist with another chap stripped to the waist, and we are fencing to first blood with fencing sabers. It was great.
Well, so it's the spirit of what I did. The risk of name dropping, but because, as you probably know, John Waller famously did the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful fights in Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yes.
And he brought John Cleese along to one of our drinking evenings once, and I did actually have the pleasure, although John Cleese is virtually twice as tall as me. I did actually do this strip to the waist with John Cleese, fencing with sabers.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God!
Because doing really wanted to get into this and understand all this sword fighting lark and things.
Wow. I wonder if he still has the scars.
I think I gave a light touch out of reference to the great man.
Fair enough. Now, you've done a lot of work in TV, and you've produced some books, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But how do you sort of reconcile working in a popular medium like TV, where everything is reduced to a soundbite, and the more kind of detailed and expansive work of writing a book?
Well, the answer is it's irreconcilable.
Okay.
So one has to come to terms with it. And television is a Faustian pact. And I get less upset these days than I used to. Television is made for a general audience.
Right.
And that's what they do. They make things for a general audience. Now, this is something that's very much on the cusp, as YouTube videos are dedicated, to specific demographics of topic interested people come in, and even probably streaming TV will target people more and more and more. So the old-fashioned TV, which is still the medium I work in, is old-fashioned TV, is for general audiences. And it goes through several stages of sausage making. So, you first of all start chatting with someone, or what do you know about this? And you tell them, and they, oh, that's really interesting. That's wonderful. That's great. Let's have you. I'd love you to tell us all about that. And off you go, and you are expansive. And then it comes out, and you go, oh, I spoke for an hour and a half, and they used 22 seconds of that. And most annoyingly, it wasn't a consecutive 22 seconds.
Right.
It was several seconds from one bit with another bit, and things you can hear that, and it's kind of been stolen from somewhere else to join two things that were never intended to be joined, and you feel very pissed off and deceived. But I took the money, which was good, and I had a great day, and you reach people. I have an email bag. I reach people, and people write to me all the time in my dotage, saying how 20 years ago they saw a program and it set them off to university to study archaeology, or they do, and that's enormously gratifying. So I feel much less aggrieved these days, because I kind of take me out of the equation now. And find, okay, it's not what I wanted to say. It's not what I wanted to do. Well, if I want to do that, well, then I need to find the money and make my own film. I'm guesting in someone else's film. They've taken what they want from me. It's doing it. And actually, it is reaching people. More recently, I've been doing, I can't tell you too much about this, but I've been doing quite a lot of work with video games companies. Okay. And making little mini documentary films for them and things. And I'm not a video games player, but I've become very, very aware of how video games have led people into history.
Absolutely.
The spark has been fired. The tinder has been laid, and the spark has been fired. And then it burns in each individual as it will. But it's a job. So
you're doing for this generation what Robert Hardy did for you.
I'd love to think that.
Well, I think it's without doubt.
I mean, Robert Hardy, and I met him and got drunk with him, and he's a lovely fella. but his public persona, his history stuff, his writing has affected me as well. Ewart and Robert Hardy have been my inspirations as an author, more than writing about what are to some fairly dry matters, but infusing them with character and colour, is what I hope I strive to do with my book writing. But just rooting back to the television question, that, I'm a words person. I love playing with words. And I like writing books. And in some ways, why I like turning a soundbite How can I make this thing that is of enormous esoteric interest to me and 7 other people with the same esoteric interest?
A bit more than 7 these days.
I know. I don't know. If it's chariots, for instance, there's not that many people as passionate about chariots as I am. It's not good.
Okay. Well, speaking of chariots, you did in your book.
You told me to give you long answers, so I'm going to finish this.
Oh, fine. All right. I'll come back to that. Carry on.
You can come back to that. Turning the soundbite is an intellectual challenge and a creative challenge of how can I communicate this to these people who have no prior knowledge or context of what I'm talking about. So I do kind of like the challenge of popular television, to try and get a few more people to share what has given me so much pleasure. It's given me a life.
Sure.
History, it's been my workplace, but it's also been my playground, and it's given me a life. And I'm so grateful to it. I kind of want to share it with everyone. So that's my part of my motivation for TV. My other motivation, apart from money, which is actually, but my other motivation, it's how I earn a living. My other motivation is vision. I'm a very visual person. That's what attracts me to sword fighting. that first kernel interest is sword fighting. And the beauty of it, the shapes, the forms. It has a kinetic beauty as it moves, but every freeze frame of form I find extraordinarily beautiful. And TV is a visual medium. And so I love creating images and images that tell stories. So plenty of motives for TV, plenty of things that drive me to do TV. So I'm not disparaging it, but it is immensely frustrating. And crafting a book is far more satisfying, feels far more personal, and you're more prolific than I have been to date. But my writing years are ahead of me now. So I hope to catch you up and surpass you soon.
I welcome it.
But there's nothing like it. That when that first book comes, it has weight, it has substance. The pages have texture. The ink still smells. It's a thing. Whereas the TV is far more ephemeral. But so they're two very different beasts. I love them both, and they just do different jobs and feed different parts of me.
Fair enough. Okay, now back to the chariots and books. A long time ago, maybe getting on for 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I read your book, Swords and Swordsmen, right, which is a fantastic book where you take like a specific historical weapon and then talk about who possibly owned it and how it would have been used and all sorts of things. It is every sword person should read that book. But in it, there's this casual throwaway line where you mention riding a chariot down Oxford Street. And Osprey, for the non-Londoners, is like the main shopping street in London. So, what happened there?
It wasn't Oxford Street, so that's a slightly different. No, I drove it from the courtyard of the British Museum, up Museum Street, down Shaftesbury Avenue, round
Shaftesbury Avenue, there we go.
Through Admiralty Arch, up the Mall, turned right at Buckingham Palace, around Hyde Park Corner in the rush hour in the morning, and joined the horse box in Hyde Park.
That's better than Oxford Street.
In the rain.
In the rain, of course.
There we go. We had made a film for the BBC. There had been a wonderfully important archaeological discovery at Wetwang in Yorkshire of an Iron Age chariot. And I was fortunate enough to be in the television programme that reconstructed that, rebuilt that, investigated that, and looked at that. Mm-hmm. And my great friend Robert Herford had built the chariot, and it was a thing of considerable beauty. And the BBC gave it to the British Museum as a permanent gift. They pop it out, I'm just saying, every so often. And as a publicity stunt for the British Museum to say they now had this chariot, which initially it was displayed in the Great Court. I took a rather timid lady Evening Standard reporter on this harebrained ride. And the thing was, many of your listeners, I'm sure, will be familiar with there is a type of gladiator called an Acidarius. An Acidarius rides an Acedum, which is a Celtic chariot, a British-style chariot. And the linguists among them will spot that the root word there is sed, as in sedentary. And what distinguishes a Celtic chariot from an Assyrian chariot, an Egyptian chariot, a Chinese chariot, a Persian chariot, etc., Hittite chariot, is that in all those chariots ridden on flat desert plains, both driver and archer are standing.
Right.
And our image of a chariot, a Roman racing chariot, you're standing. But the Acedum, the British chariot, the Celtic chariot found in northern France, in Scotland, in Wales, in Yorkshire, the driver is sitting. And we have this in written textual stuff, and we have it in imagery, on coins, on the Padua Stella. We know that the driver of these countries sits. The warrior stands and uses a javelin, not a bow, but the driver sits. Now, for the film, for the BBC, we got some little ponies that were the right size for the thing, and I sat, drove it. Wonderful, all good. By the time the film was edited, which takes a few months, and we were doing this thing for the British Museum, it was nearly Christmas. And those ponies, being showbiz ponies, were in pantomime in Bournemouth. So we had to get some other ponies for the British Museum gig. And the harness of these early chariots is completely different to modern harness, completely different. That really would be going down an esoteric path to explain that to you, but it's very different.
Okay.
So we got these two scurry ponies and we put them in it, and they'd never been in a town before. They came from, somebody hired them, I had nothing to do with it. And they're shaking in the courtyard, and they're in this really unfamiliar tack, which has no traces. It means their hindquarters can swing out, all sorts of things can go wrong, and the whole thing can break apart. And there's a huge amount of jeopardy with this. And they were that little bit too tall, taller than the ones that should be for the chariot. So when I sat down, I couldn't see.
Oh, no.
So for that ride, I did have to stand up. But of course, you're standing up in a chariot that's got no front.
God.
If you tip in there, you're in the sort of the meat grinder of hooves being dragged by the axle. But so I had to stand up in it. And what I knew was these horses are very, very nervous. This whole setup is extremely fragile, and they haven't been trained to use it. What they need to do is trust me. The thing I've learned more about horses than anything else, there was a show jumper back in the 50s, and there was a big international show jumping competition in South Africa. And he'd gone there, and his horse had gone lame. And someone in the South African team had lent him a horse. And he was seen riding it into receptions in marquees, up the steps of buildings. And they said, "What are you doing? What do you know?" He said, "Look, I know it can jump, or you wouldn't have lent it to me. I need it to trust me."
Right.
So when they opened the gates of the British Museum forecourt, I said, "Get up, boys!" And we galloped out into the museum.
Oh, God.
Thundered them down the museum. We ran red lights. And it's the only way to deal with London in the rush hour is in a chariot. Everybody parts. The taxis stop. They wave. Good on you, mate. It's wonderful. And we absolutely hurtled down Shaftesbury Avenue, only to discover that how many manhole covers there are on Shaftesbury Avenue. One of the horses was terrified of them because they looked like black holes.
Right.
And Shaftesbury Avenue was covered in manhole covers. And so we did this serpentine gallop down Shaftesbury Avenue, by which time you got all the adrenaline out of them and they settled. And we had a very pleasant ride the rest of the time. but I had a long. It was raining, and I had a long sort of a riding coat on, that comes down to your ankles. And this poor lady reporter, she was just so petrified. She sat behind me with her head under my coat almost the entire journey.
I've been wondering about that chariot ride for a while. Thank you very much for telling me the backstory. Okay. Now, you've mentioned archery quite a lot, and clearly it's a deep interest. And you've written the book on warbows, literally written the book on warbows. So can you tell us something about, I've made some bows, but nothing of war weight, nothing heavier than about a 40-pound draw. So I have some experience of how bows are made and, that sort of thing. But by all means, tell us.
Tell you something about bows. I will.
Yes. There's a nice open question for you. What do you wish the general sort of sword-interested audience would know archery?
Let's start with the title. So it's called warbow. Yeah. So that's a modern construction, the word warbows.
Sure.
So it has been, and I think it's a very useful one as well. So particularly with regard to the so-called English longbow, although French armies had them, German armies had them,
but they're English, damn it!
Exclusive. It was not exclusive, but it won fame in English armies. And
sure.
Connection and all sorts of things feed into this. But the word warbow was coined to distinguish between the sort of lighter draw weight recreational longbows and the military longbow of the Middle Ages. So the military longbow of the Middle Ages, was a much chunkier beast. And it also was a different, the Victorians changed the longbows. You have these kind of Victorian longbows, which are very stiff in the centre section, and they're still a longbow. They have a D section, cross section, and people say, I'm a longbow shooter, but most of them are only shooting Victorian style longbows, which is fine. They're lovely bows. I shot them for years. But the Mary Rose discovery has obviously changed. There were two Mary Rose bows that existed in the Royal Armouries collections, which had been excavated earlier. But the big find in the 80s when they were all brought up, and I remember, life has lots of adventures, but it has certain key moments that are more memorable than others. And I remember when the bows were first brought up, and as you know, they were in the mud in the Solent, which had preserved them. This organic material had been preserved, quite remarkable,
extraordinary,
quite extraordinary. Wooden things done survive, but of course, once they were brought up, there was a real issue of how do we keep them. They hadn't built the museum then, and all its wonders. And Robert Hardy was one of the trustees from the outset, and the place with the sort of, I think I can say this now. It used to be a secret, but I think now he has passed. We can say that the place with the right humidity to keep them stabilised until they could get something purpose built was his wine cellar.
Okay, Robert Hardy's wine cellar.
Yes.
Wow.
Which was considerable, I can tell you. And I remember John Waller and a couple of other friends. We went to see them, shortly after they were lifted and deposited there. And so, I was imong the first people to handle and inspect them. And that's a pretty powerful memory.
Can I imagine?
It's as exciting as opening an original Talhofer. I mean, it's that direct connection with history. It's wonderful. But anyway, I digress. What was apparent from the girth of them, etc., was that these poundages, the draw weights, far exceeded what anyone had previously believed. And obviously that remains contentious, and people, but you've got people like Joe Gibbs now, who he's no bigger than me. I mean, he's younger and fitter and stronger. He's a little guy, and he draws a 200-pound bow.
I've seen it on YouTube, and I didn't believe it.
And it's phenomenal, and he's accurate with it. It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
But you've got others like Ian Coote and Mark Stretton and a host of, there's dozens and dozens of them now, people who pull in excess of 180. And it's transforming our idea. Now, because that is possible, means our upper ceiling has to rise. That is not the same as saying that a Longbow warbow is 180 or 200 pounds.
No.
Because I think one of the things I address in the book, I think people get obsessed with the wrong questions.
Okay. What's the right question?
People are obsessed with penetration. Okay. And it's from the lad on the internet who said, "Oh, I pierced my mum's saucepan lid with my longbow last week, and so they must have been able to pierce armour." And you go, "Well, there's 5,000 factors that you're missing there." Yes. I can do this with that. There are so many variables that affect whether a longbow arrow can penetrate armour. Can it? Yes. Did it always? No. What's the percentages? Hard to work out, but that's kind of the question. If armour is a passion for armour, a study of armour has to be in complete equilibrium with the passion and study of the weapons that are designed to attack it.
Of course.
You cannot consider one without a thorough knowledge and appreciation of the other, which is why the section on longbows in there has a large section on armour of the period. The right question for me is, what is the probable rate of shooting? Now, we used to say, I used to, the days when I was shooting a 70-pound bow, which I could no longer do, partly because of age, and partly because I had an accident with a Turkish bow a few years back when I was trying to string it, a powerful one, and it turned inside out, and it snapped my scaphoid bone.
Ouch.
And I went a year thinking, when is this sprain going to heal? And then by the time I had an X-ray, they said, "Oh, it's a non-union fracture, and if you don't have surgery, you're going to lose the use of your hand. We'll have to take a bit of bone from your hip and you won't be able to ride for a year because it will be in a cast." I'm not ride for a year. Fuck off! I'm not doing that. Anyway, it seems to. They say I'm a medical miracle because I've still got use of the hand. It hasn't shifted. But they said at my age there would only have been a 50% chance of that surgery having effect anyway. So I kind of rolled the dice. But it means I can only shoot lightweight bows.
Fair enough.
To complete that tangent. Coming back to the main thread, which is what is the rate of shooting that is probable? Let's do an ad absurdum first. If the 5,000 archers at Agincourt, for instance, could all shoot 10 arrows a minute, that's 50,000 arrows a minute. Well,
that's a lot of arrows.
If they can penetrate armour, the entire French army is wiped out. Everyone's dead.
Yes.
Everyone's dead in a matter of minutes.
Yeah. Which is not what happened.
Which is not what happened. So we're missing something. You have to start with that ad absurdum argument. In extremis, everyone's dead. So it's not that bad, but people did die, and it did have effect. So what is much more probable? So in terms of the draw weight of the thing, you trade off impact for rate of shooting, because obviously it is much more tiring.
Yeah.
If you go down to the gym and bench press 200 pounds or whatever, you can do X repetitions.
Yeah. But you can do a lot more than twice as many of them.
If you take that down to 50 pounds, you can do so many more repetitions.
Right. And much faster.
It's the same with pulling a bow.
Yeah.
So once you get that idea, it asks all sorts of things. So if you've got 5,000 archers, maybe one of the reasons for having so many archers is that everybody doesn't have to be shooting at once.
That seems likely.
Maybe you only have 1,000 of the 5,000 shooting, and they all get 5 shots rest before that becomes one of the thoughts of that. Then the other thought is, well, at what range is your ammunition most effective? Yes, you can, with a powerful bow, you can shoot, 200-300 meters. And they probably did sometimes. But that image of archers shooting up in the air is a Hollywood image. Laurence Olivier, Henry V, legendary.
We do see it in some manuscripts also.
No, you don't. You will see it in what you will see in medieval manuscripts. Please send it to me if you've got it.
Okay.
What you will see in medieval manuscripts is people shooting more or less horizontally, very little elevation.
Okay.
And there may be other explanations for that, but you will see that. You will see people shooting in elevation, and in other words, pointing upwards, in a siege situation.
Yes.
So there's no barrier to being able to shoot up, but it's a siege situation. Or it is in later illustrations where they're doing something like the Finsbury Marks, where they're shooting around to do long distance target shooting, if you like, parabolic into a mark. But medieval battle manuscripts don't show them shooting up in the air. Please send me if you have it. Have a look, please do. I've been looking for it for years. So the art tends to contradict. There can be reasons for that because they are compressing the scene and the distance between the armies, and it might look stupid if they would do that. So that could, there's an argument that they do that. But the point is, it's not. The evidence is against it rather than for it. It doesn't make sense on arrow stocks point of view. Medieval arrows, an extremely expensive piece of ammunition.
Yes.
Compared to a musket ball.
Yeah. Well, they take a long time to make for a start.
Labor intensity, the amount of materials you want. You've got to season your wood, and then you cleave your wood, and then you into square blanks, and then you use various different planes to plane that down into a cylinder, and it's a tapered cylinder. It's bobtail to make it more aerodynamic. Enormous sculptural carpentry required just to make a single shaft. You've then got to match those shafts so they all match, with some companions. They shoot consistently from a bow. Then you've got to get your feathers and peel the hard bit, the quill off those. Then get some rabbit hide glue mixed up, and you pop those on, but that's not strong enough. So you've then got to spiral wind some silk thread to put it on. Then you've got to file a slot, and then you've got to put a bit of horn insert into the slot because a heavy blow would explode the nock. Then you actually cut the nock. Then you round and file that off, and then you put a compound in between the feathers to prevent feather mites from getting it, as a copper sulfide compound in there. And then you would file the front end to take a head, and then you've got all the work of the arrowsmith to make an arrowhead. So an arrow is a very expensive bit of ammunition and not something that can be knocked up in the camp the night before. Therefore, you have to take your arrow supplies with you. And we know they took, 1.5 million arrows on some of these French campaigns in barrels and on wagons, and how many wagons they had. We know this stuff. But even 1.5 million arrows is finite, and you don't know if you're at Cressy, you don't know if you're at Agincourt, whether or not that's the last battle of it.
Right.
And you have already used an amount of your arrows on the campaign in skirmishes before now. So how many arrows have you got left at that battle? At Agincourt, they were really quite low. They'd almost run out of arrows. And they ran out very early in the battle of Agincourt. And you don't know. You've got to husband your resources because you may yet need your archers next week. You may not yet make your ships in time. So making decisions about when to shoot becomes very, very important. I can't say I've got the answers, but what I think I do is I help to ask these questions. Don't assume Laurence Olivier was the expert.
Well, he was an expert actor and a very good director, but he wasn't an archer.
You know the famous thing with the armour, don't you?
Yeah.
With the armour, where he goes to Sir James Mann, who was the then. I mean, the Henry V film is a wonderful, wonderful film. I mean, I saw it when I was 10 years old. They showed it at school, and it was the moment where I was first seduced into a passion for Shakespeare and a passion for history. And I still have those two passions. I mean, that film did something for me. But, famously, Olivier went to Sir James Mann of the Royal Armouries to get some advice, and Mann said, I do hope you're not going to have that, perpetuate that nonsense of knights being winched into the saddle. And Olivier said, well, why not? It's wonderful. And he said, well, because it didn't happen. It's a bogus thing. And it cropped up in a music hall sketch in a musical comedy called When Knights Were, in days of old when knights were bold, which we played in the West End in the 1890s or something, when this image first occurred. And Olivier said, well, very well, I shall only have the French do it then. And so you see this sort of comedic scene of these French knights hanging like that. And it's still in the public imagination. It's still, armour aficionados are trying to explain to people that it wasn't that heavy.
Right. And Jean Le Maingre II, Marshal Boucicaut, who led the vanguard of the French knights.
Underside of that with his arms.
Exactly. And he was reputed to be able to vault into his horse without using his hands.
Of course, without using the hands is a bit of a trick, but
without using the hands is the hard part.
The hard part, absolutely. No,
so he definitely didn't need winching.
The exploding of myths is canon.
Yes, it's part of what we do, isn't it?
It's a lot of the motivation, whether we were interested in swords or bows or armour, dogs. It's all exploding the myths is the thing. But just to come back to my Warbows book, because I was banging on as I'm prone to do about some of the
podcast gold, sir. It's podcast gold.
The Warbows title does not just refer to the European longbow, English longbow. It refers to the crossbow. It refers to the composite bow, whether it's the Manchu bow or the Turkish bow or the Mongol bow or all of those wonderful bows, and to the Japanese bow. So it has 4 principal sections, of which war bows was the catchiest catch-all phrase. We could have called it military bows, but war bows was kind of a better title. So it is a book about military bows, and it's Japanese and Turkish and Chinese, English, and the crossbow, which is so underestimated, so undervalued, so ostracized and in a sort of snobby way, but was just such a mainstream weapon in the Middle Ages. And you need to. And one of the things I love about archery is exactly the same thing I love about sword fighting, which is my enjoyment of the physical doing of. I like to sword fight. I like to shoot bows. My enjoyment of the physical doing of has led me into a study of the history of, and that study has been a passport to the world, because it takes me to all these different cultures. I love the multicultural study aspect of it. In school, we're taught British history from a British point of view, or if you're French history from a French point of view, or Hungarian history. It's always so nationalistic, the way history is taught and used.
Yeah.
And for me, that's not what history is. History is the human story of all of us, and it's that shared. And I love our little niche passions of sword fighting and bows, because they took me into the cultures around the world, and my life is richer for it.
I've had the exact same experience. I mean, I have, with sword people, it doesn't really matter if you're doing, 16th century Japanese swordsmanship, or you're doing Chinese swordsmanship, or you're doing Kali Eskrima with swords. Sword people are sword people. And
yes. Yeah, and the human biodynamics are the same.
Right, exactly.
Just there are certain cultural traditions and approaches that will come at it slightly differently, and that's fascinating.
And technological changes also, which affect the weapon, which affects the use, and so on. Wonderful. Okay. Now, I have to ask you about dogs.
Oh, good.
I have a feeling that is a sufficient question for you, sir.
There you go. This may come as a surprise, but I have recently had a book about dogs published.
I know.
And so you might say, well, gosh, dogs, where does that fit into it all? Well, I love dogs, and who doesn't? And I've always loved dogs. but it's the same. You said some very kind things about swords and swordsmen earlier. This is the same book, substituting dogs for swords. In other words, it tells stories. It's a route into history. And sort of in the same way that with Swords and Swordsmen, I would take a particular sword that was owned by whether it's George Washington's sword or Henry V's sword or Maximilian's sword or whatever, and set it in its socio-cultural context and military context, and what was the sword fighting styles like at the time, what are the manufacturing processes at the time, and here's some stories about the life of the person. It's kind of the same with dogs, because whether it's swords, whether it's bows, whether it's dogs, working on something about horses, but whether it's those, the form and function is key. So they all have that in common. They all connect form and function. And from that, there is an aesthetic. Now, this is not an anti-mongrel dog. I love mongrels. And we have some very serious problems with dogs in our and abandonment in our cultures, and if anyone who's in a position to be able to take a rescue dog from a shelter, they really should. But we do also have our heritage breeds, our Labradors and our Spaniels, and it's a much more fragile heritage than you may think. With our dogs, we tend to. It's a really hot topic, dogs. It's a slightly, the nastiness you get on the internet about swords or bows pales into insignificance with the passions aroused by
dogs.
But up until the mid-19th century, the dogs we have, the types of dogs, scent hounds, sight hounds, flock guardians, cart dogs, sled dogs, game finders, etc., evolved by dint of human management, interference, selective breeding for dogs to do a particular service. Yeah. And that's very much at the heart of a partnership. And that includes companion dogs bred specifically to be the lap dogs, the parlour dogs, what in the Middle Ages were called the chamber dogs. Very valuable, possibly the most valuable service that dogs do. I was intrigued by this, and I thought, so the book is organised according to job, according to task. Not what they do now, obviously the guide dogs for the blind, or service dogs, or bomb detection, or all of that. Great. This is about when this particular type came into being, where are we in history, and what was going on. So we start with herding dogs, collies, and then droving dogs, corgi. So I had, which is my sort of signature hands-on experience. So I herded 80 sheep with a border collie. I went to a farmer in Wilf Wells in Wales who still herds his black cattle with a corgi, because corgis were droving dogs. They would nip at the heels of the dog, and but because when the cow kicks at them, they're low and it misses. We've got a lovely action shot of that happening.
Oh wow!
So people, but that allows me to tell you about drovers' roads and the beginnings of banks and all manner of social history that's tucked away in that, and the sheepdog thing, because when you send sheep away, the dog goes with them, and so dogs export all over the world, so the dogs in Australia connect with the dogs in America who came from Poland via England. And all of that starts to get very interesting. And then the sled dogs takes you, into bits of American history. I went dog sledding in Alaska, which was stunning, bucket list adventure. It was wonderful. But it took me also, I'm able to tell the history of the Klondike Gold Rush. I'm able to tell the history of the old trappers, in those pioneering days. It's rich historical period and time and place that these dogs took me to. The cart dogs chapter is one of my favourites, and it's like, we don't do that, but dogs pulled carts all over Europe.
I didn't know that.
Yes, but you think, especially about little tiny alleys in towns, then it's not room to get a horse and cart up. I live in Portugal now. We've got all these little tiny alleys in our gorgeous little historical town where we are in the south. You couldn't get a horse and cart up the alley, but you could get a dog cart up there to bring you your bread, to bring you your daily milk, for the man with the grindstone to come and sharpen your knives and swords, who would have the grindstone on the back of a dog cart. So you've got all of this. And then, extraordinary, in the First World War, the Belgian army used dogs to pull Vickers machine guns on carts, which was a brilliant thing, because in the Low Country of Belgium, when the German advance, the idea was to do a pincer movement on France, and one of it swept up through Belgium. And Belgium very much had a sort of 19th century army at the time, but they were incredibly brave and resistant. I mean, quite quickly overwhelmed, but they put up one hell of a fight. And they had these regiments, full regiments of machine gun dogs. And the Vickers machine guns are on carts with pneumatic tires, rubber tires, so very silent. So unlike a horse, a dog, is completely silent.
Yeah.
And especially in the low dune country of Belgium, it's low. So you could get a spotter, a man who could crawl up on his belly and look, and then he could see enemy forces approaching. And with a whistle, his dog team would run the machine gun up to him. He'd unshackle them, they'd go back, turn around, use the machine gun, and it was an extraordinary thing. And that breed died out, but some people in Belgium had reconstructed it. So I've got wonderful photos in there of this reconstructed Belgian Mastiff with machine gun carriage. And then there were Dalmatians, which were carriage dogs. And I drove a carriage with a Dalmatian tucked under around leafy lanes in Sussex. And that takes you, George Washington ordered a new carriage dog. It takes you to American history. There's just wonderful stories of the mail coaches and their Dalmatians guarding them. And then it sweeps on into water dogs. And of course, did you know that poodles were originally duck hunters? And John Keyes spelt Johannes Caius because he was physician to Elizabeth I. But he also wrote the first book about dogs in English. But when you say Keyes College, Cambridge, although it's spelled Caius, and of course it's given generations of Cambridge students a wonderful sort of one-upmanship that they know how to pronounce the name of their college. But he actually came from Norwich, so he was plain old John Keyes from Norwich. But he went to university in Italy, and it was fashionable for young men to Latinize their names. So he's published as Johannes Caius, even though Johannes Caius is pronounced John Keyes. So that's why Keyes College, Cambridge is pronounced like that.
Okay.
Anyway, he wrote the first book on dogs, and he talks about the water spaniels, which is what a poodle is, retrieving the shooter's crossbow bolts when they miss. And I went to visit some duck hunting poodles in Georgia in America. And I took a crossbow and with blunts, because that's what you would use to hunt ducks, because you wouldn't want to spoil the meat for the table. But also, if you miss, if it hasn't got a metal head, it doesn't sink, it floats. And these poodles retrieved my crossbow bolts wonderfully.
Oh, wow.
Tooth mark or a bite. So that there is some military stuff in there. And obviously we get into the history of Labradors, golden retrievers, and other water dogs, all with fabulous histories, and then we get into the hunting breeds. And because I want the book to be available to everyone, and hunting's a very polarizing issue. Personally, I have no problem shooting a duck. I love duck, it's great food.
Yeah.
But I have great respect for people who have, gentler attitudes and kinder attitudes to wildlife. And I'm very mixed on some of that. I'm very anti-trophy hunting. So but I will end up using 5 chapters explaining my views on hunting and qualifying that. The easiest thing, there's no hunting activity that I can't either simulate or substitute. So that when I'm in the Jordanian desert with a Saluki, which and the way they used to hunt with them is they used to go out into the desert on a camel with a Saluki on their lap to save its feet. For the chase, and carrying a falcon, and you might ride for days. And then you'd fly the hawk, and the hawk, when it sees a gazelle, is trained to dive bomb on the gazelle, because they feed it gazelle eyes, so it does. But of course, it can't take down a gazelle. But the Saluki can see the dot drop from the sky, jumps off your camel, and gives chase. Well, so I went out on a camel with a Saluki on my lap carrying a hawk in the room.
Of course you did, Mike. Of course you did.
But when we wanted to get shots of the Saluki's action, the wonderful, powerful sight hound action, we just drove a 4x4 with a lure behind it. It chased the lure, so we didn't actually hunt it.
Right.
We had all the ingredients. When I went to the New Forest with a pack of hounds, much as I love galloping across countryside, I don't want to follow a trail hunt. I want to be with the hounds. So they let me take them on hound exercise, which is the greatest dog walk I've ever had, because I took 56 hounds off leash for a walk through the New Forest.
Oh, wow.
I was at the front and they taught me to crack a whip. And I said, give it, do it. And they obeyed me. It was wonderful. And so it's an adventure book. It's a history book. For the companion dogs, I thought, well, I'm going to have the neighbour's chihuahua on my lap. No, it's not quite me. So I thought, well, I'm going to go back to the heart of it all, to the root of it all, to where it all started. I want to meet some wolves. So what I ended up doing was meeting some wolf dogs, which were 98% wild wolf. And that was in Northern California. And we spent about an hour before this she-wolf actually came up to me. She was so wary, she slinked and skulked and darted. Oh, but you could feel how that first connection, for us both to trust each other. It was powerful. So it's an experiential book, unpacks gazillion little nuggets of social history that the dogs are kind of off leash and off trail, and they sent out these fascinating little stories. We meet these quirky dog people, where I went all over the world meeting these quirky dog people, and it's about the dogs, and it's about so it's adventures, and it also has a message, and the message is the history of these things is much more recent than you think. We've lost more breeds than we've created. The dogs of today are not the dogs of yesteryear. I've taken the modern approximations. So like a Dalmatian, we talked about as a carriage dog. The Dalmatian's job as a carriage dog was to guard the coach, to guard the horses, it was a guard dog. It therefore had a certain amount of aggression. Because they're so lovely, people have now bred them with all the qualities of stamina, but they're sweet-natured. So we bred them out of them, which is fine. But in the days of coach travel or horse travel, if you stopped at an inn, the coachman used to have to sleep with his horses, because otherwise they'd be stolen.
Right. Yes.
Unless he had a Dalmatian who would sleep with the horses, and he could get have an inn and have a bed in the tavern. And the way they do that is they imprint the dog imprints with the horses. So as a puppy, it goes in with the horses, and so the dog doesn't follow the carriage. What the dog does is he actually follows the horses. Many wonderful tales about that. So the message is that the dogs have changed, and they can change again, and we need to watch it. So we tend to put our tribal values. So it's like, if you kind of want to be cool and groovy, and you will only have mongrels and sheltered dogs, because you don't want to seem elitist and have pedigree dogs. Mm-hmm. If you want to be snooty and show-offy, you have pedigree dogs and you eschew these wretched tykes and mongrels and curs. Yeah. Neither of those things is a valid argument. Dogs are dogs. They don't know what they are. They all deserve love, care, and human kindness. So I refute both of those things. But the Kennel Club system has created some terrible things. So the flat-faced dogs that can't breathe and cannot give natural birth, that is an abomination. And people say, oh, well, poor old bulldog. He can't breathe properly and he snuffles. It's a bit cute, and his head is so round and he looks like Churchill, and his sin's all sack. Well, that's because they've been bred to look like a fucking baby with round eyes in the centre and wrinkly skin and puffing and snuffling and snortling, and he can't walk properly because he looks like a bloody toddler. And so that's why I find them cute. I know some bulldogs. I think they're great. But do you know what happened? What happened was we used to have an abhorrent sport called
bull baiting.
Bull baiting.
Yeah. Where
people would gamble on how long the dogs could stay on the bull.
Right.
So they're what we call brachycephalic, which means they have a relatively broad mouth rather than dolichocephalic, which is the long mouth of a sighthound. So a greyhound or a snook, it's got a long snout because it catches prey on the move. So it's got kind of pinchers, like a pair of pliers, like long-nosed pliers to snatch at the prey. Whereas a mastiff or bullock has a broad mouth because you can grip and hold on for longer with a broad mouth. You get more teeth engaged. And can hold for longer. So it's a holding dog. So this is what the bulldogs were used for. When that was quite rightly outlawed, then, of course, people no longer had a reason to keep bulldogs, except they had these rather lovable natures. And they had these lovable natures because if you have a vicious dog, like the dogs that are used for dog fighting, pit bulls and things. I know people with pit bulls, and they're gorgeous dogs, lovely, affectionate, gentle dogs. They're not what the press make them out to be at all, unless they're brought up by the.
They're trained to be that way, yeah.
So these dogs tend to have nice temperaments because if they're an aggressive dog, they need to be able to be handled by their owner. You need to be able to pull it off a bull. You need to be able to pull it out of a dogfight. So they're lovely temperaments. So people did want them as pets. So what they then did, as soon as bull baiting is made illegal in Britain, they start to cross the bulldog with the pug, which is this flat-faced dog from China, bred as a companion for all those
companionship virtues,
smooth skin, baby-fied dog. Although I wouldn't mind a pug if it had a long. There's a famous picture of Hogarth with his pug, and it's got a perfectly reasonable snout. It can breathe. But it's just gradually squashed it to make it flatter and flatter and more human. And people say, poor old thing, that's what he's like. No, it's not what he's like. We made him like that, and you need to know that. This is not something that occurs in nature. We have done this. And Alsatians with sloping haunches because it looks like they're about to reap, but they get terrible hip pain, and Dachshunds with their backs too long. Long's okay, but too long's not okay. Exaggerated features. So it's like trying to promote an awareness of this and say we are also inbreeding too much. How sustainable is this? This experiment's only 150, 200 years old with these restricted pedigree lines. You've got to open it up. You've got to breed. Why not breed a Cocker Spaniel with a Springer Spaniel? They're both Spaniels. They don't have such narrow lines. Let's breed for health. And the dogs we have today are the way they are because they were bred for function. I'm not saying you have to use them for function.
But they were bred for it.
But that's why they look the way they do. Basset Hound has long, floppy ears because as they flap, it wafts the scent up into his nose. But he's not supposed to tread on the bloody things. So don't exaggerate it. The book has a message.
Clearly. All right. Now, Mike, I do have a couple of questions to finish up on, and I hesitate to ask you this one because I can't think of anything you might not have done. So, what is the best idea you've never acted on?
Well, we have to put never acted on yet, don't we?
Fair. Okay, never acted on yet.
Part of me is inclined to say I wish I had gone to law school.
Really? I can't believe it.
But I don't know that I mean it. So that kind of depends what mood I'm in.
Why on earth?
Because I have had this glorious life.
Yeah.
Of adventure.
Horses and dogs and swords and bows.
What the hell I want. I've been all over I've shot blowpipes with Jaguar Indians in the Peruvian jungle, in the Amazon. I've been to Japan, I've been to China, with privileged and not as a tourist, but with privileged access.
Yeah.
To museums, to behind the scenes, to seeing things. You know what I mean? I was excavating a chariot in China a few years ago, and we found little bits of paint.
Right.
from 1500 BC. And I picked that little bit of flake of paint out of the day. I mean, I've done things I couldn't even dream of doing. So I have to be so grateful for my life. But, I am not 30 anymore, and financial security is a concern. It hasn't been a straight path or an easy path. It's been a bumpy path. I've mostly enjoyed it. I've mostly had fun. But there's that bit of me going, well, if you had gone to law school, you could still have done a lot of this, but you'd have had a bit of a backup pension. But I don't know. I don't know if I believe that. So that may be the best thing. And the best idea I've never acted on. Here's the serious answer. Okay. I don't think there is a best idea that I've never acted, other than to say I started acting on them far later than I needed to.
Okay.
My 20s and my 30s, and even into my 40s, I was starting to do it by my 40s, but I hadn't really found my way. So, when you say you wrote your first book at 31, I mean, I am in awe. I wish I'd written my first book, because I got so many books in here that I yet want to write, and I'm worried I'll run out of time. So I wish I'd started certain things earlier. But no, that's it. That's the answer.
That's fair. I mean, the thing is, I spent the first 15 years of my swordsmanship career as a professional after starting my school. It took me about 15 years to get any semblance of financial security at all. And I basically was 2 weeks away from bankruptcy that entire time, right? And there were times when I would be walking down the street and I'd see people working in offices, in the office buildings in the street. And I would go, do you know what? Just showing up at the same time every day, doing what I'm told, going home again in the evening, and getting paid a regular amount of money every month, regardless. That sounds that sounds so relaxing,
doesn't it?
Right, but
it wouldn't suit.
Right, and every single person I've ever met who works in an office, who find out what I do for a living, not one of them has gone, oh, thank God I don't have to do that. Not one.
No, I know.
So, yeah.
So I think, if you make an edit choice, it would be that second part. There would be nothing I haven't acted on. I'm kind of doing most of it, and yet things to do, and I'm gonna, I haven't run out of steam by any means.
Books to write.
Good. I'm not that hard up. I'm doing all right. If I was a lawyer, I'd be doing a lot better. But it is, I wish I'd got going earlier. And it was to do with the culture of the time and an insecurity and being the first. Other people weren't doing it. And it took longer to do out of the box things.
Yeah. When I think people who are starting swordsmanship clubs and schools now, where the level they can start at is so much higher than what I could start at in 2001 when I started my school professionally.
No, exactly.
And what you were doing in the 70s or 80s.
I wouldn't have done the drama schools. At the time, teaching sword fighting in drama schools was a way of being paid and experimenting with what I loved.
Sure.
But if there had been the infrastructure there is now, then, I'd have gone and studied with Dave Rawlings and whatever, and you even. It would have been a different story. So,
sure. Okay. Well, there's no bad thing to be a pioneer. But, okay. My last question. Somebody gives you a large pot of cash to spend educating the public on weapons of history. What would you do with the money?
Paint a castle.
Okay.
So, I'm slightly going to stretch your question to say,
by all means,
that castles are weapons, which of course they are. They are tools of conquest. They're aircraft carriers for horses.
Right.
In order to control the land, you put castles in strategic places, and you can control the land a day's ride around it. The horses need grain and fodder and shoes and security at night. So the castle's a weapon. And one of my bête noirs is the way in which the medieval world is portrayed in grayscale.
Oh God, it's so annoying. Yes, and everyone's dirty faced.
Yeah,
everyone's mucky. It's like they didn't wash.
No, all of that.
Yeah.
And well, we're getting all sorts of things there because a lot of that, why Hollywood does that, why we portray our history the way we do, is the same way that the Victorians portrayed their history. And it's always looking back and looking down. It's always to do with aren't we better? And I don't believe that. I believe we're different. But I've yet to be persuaded that we're that much better. So it is using history to make us feel better about ourselves, I think, is one of the problems with historical drama. But the grey thing, I think, really starts with castles.
Okay.
So castles weren't grey. Look at medieval manuscripts. They're mostly white, but they can be pink. Okay. It depends on what the local soil is like, because they were plastered and lime washed on the outside.
Right. Like the White Tower and the Tower of London.
They were plastered and highly decorated and elaborately furnished with soft furnishings and tapestries and curtains and cushions and gorgeous, sumptuous luxury, because they were the dwelling places of the nobility. But every little detail would have been painted. And so I think to paint a castle, especially from the outside, to make it white, is a great announcement to the world. Look again. History's not what you think it is. Look at the sword fighting. Look at the archery. Look at everything, because it's not what you grew up believing. Now, are grey castles beautiful? Yes, they have a sculptural beauty. But in the same way that Roman statues weren't white, they were painted. They had the eye to paint. All this scrubbed clean. Do I like it? Do I like Greek statues and Roman statues? I love it because I love shape and form. So the aesthetics I've got no problem with. And I would probably find ancient Rome rather gaudy and trashy. But because I've been brought up in our culture, which is a very grey culture. But by painting so if I had money to get to really restore a medieval castle and paint it, I think that would be a tremendous announcement to say, hey, look at the Middle Ages again. Look at the art. Look how bright and gaudy and colourful it was. People, whatever class, you're seeing serfs and peasants in a blue smock and red hose rolled down their leg, and it colour everywhere. They loved colour, and I think that's the first inroad into breaking open people's imagination to let in all sorts of other information. So at this castle, we could have sword fighting and archery and we could educate them about that.
That is a fantastic answer. It wasn't at all what I was expecting. That's brilliant though. But you're absolutely right. It's like, it wasn't grayscale. I mean, I used to work as an antiques restorer, so I've seen some insights into this. And looking at the tapestries and the painted hanging cloth, if you couldn't afford a tapestry, you had a painting on a piece of cloth.
Yes.
Because painting was cheaper, right? Because, the viewers can't see it, but you can see that, I've got blue.
Yes, you have a colourful room. Guy has a very colourful room. He has a wonderful scarlet wall with some excellent
with the swords on it. Yes.
And then behind that, it's a tricolour room. Behind that, there is a sort of a turquoisey wall.
That's actually dark green. Dark green there and light blue.
Green, and then a blue on the other side. Very medieval colours.
Right, because that's what it was.
That's what it's like. Scabbards.
Right. Glorious.
DPK scabbard, and he makes the most exquisite scabbards, and they are brightly coloured and just wonderful works of art. And the scabbard is a very overlooked part of sword furniture, I find.
Everyone knows about Excalibur, but they don't know that if you had the scabbard, you would not bleed to death.
Yes.
Right? And everyone forgets that bit, because it's like Excalibur is the sexy swordy bit, but really, the scabbard was just as important.
Absolutely, scabbards hugely important. And of course, the thing is with scabbards and the tapestries you were talking about, and the kind of organic materials tend not to survive. And even if they do, mostly colours fade. And the thing with castles, it's the reason they're all grey is because once they went out of use, the roofs went, and once the roof goes,
the inside goes.
Everything, all the plaster falls off. Rain and weather and time take their toll. The colours fade, the plaster falls off, and you're left with the brickwork.
And there were deliberate.
Their house, now and take the roof off.
Pretty soon, all the colour goes.
How superficial all your colouring and furnishing is in a house, and that's all you've got with castles. The floorboards have gone, the tiles have gone,
and even in castles where they haven't, they've gone through things like the Reformation, where and
there's that as well.
There's this fashion to kind of get rid of anything gaudy or decorative.
And of course, obviously in England, because of the English Reformation, and then particularly obviously with after Henry, then Cromwell with his Puritan streak, the churches were all scrubbed clean, but churches were hugely elaborately decorated.
Yeah.
Bright and good, which obviously you'll still find in Catholic churches in Europe. You'll still find that opulent luxury of decoration, but which is a great insight into the medieval world, because that's where other opulent interiors like castles would have been equally decorated and gilded and coloured.
I would pay money to see a castle done properly.
Yeah. Well, because they're doing Guédelon. You know about Guédelon.
Yeah.
Guédelon in France is obviously a reconstructed castle, but there's a magical place for you.
Yeah. Well, Mike.
So you said this would take an hour. I just looked.
Well, I normally they take an hour, but there was no way I was going to interrupt the flow. It's been an absolute education talking to you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Great pleasure. All the very best.
Thanks for listening. You can find the episode show notes at swordschool.com/podcast, where you will find transcriptions, photos, videos, and links for this episode. You can find a direct link to the show notes for this episode in the description. Join us next week for another cracking conversation. See you then.